Okay, here we go. So we're on to the next one here. So Jen Adams is a certified elementary and special education teacher. She holds a registered behavioral technician and principal certificate in the state of Pennsylvania on top of her teaching credentials. Jen has taught in elementary for 4 years, alternative education for 1 year, and special education classrooms 8 years for a total of 13 years. She currently is teaching fully virtually as an autistic support teacher for students in grades 1st through 9th grade. Jen loves helping other teachers and families find ways to foster independence for their students, both in their classrooms and in their homes. Make sure to connect with her on Instagram or Facebook or anywhere at Teach Love Autism, and get ready to give a warm welcome for Jen Adams.
Hey guys.
Woohoo! We're so excited to have you, Jen. We can't wait to see what you have for us today.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. All right. I'm glad you guys are all good and danced out and you're ready to sit and learn a little bit. I will be honest, after eating and doing some dancing, I hope we're going to make it through my presentation, but it was super fun. All right. So today I'm going to start sharing my screen here so you guys can see my presentation. All right, so today I plan on sharing with you 5 ways you can foster independence in your classroom. So we all know how important it is to make sure that we're doing things for our students so that they can do better once they leave us. Our jobs as educators are not just to do things for them in the classroom, it's also to be doing things for them outside of it. Let me just make sure I got my chat up here too so I can see you guys when you're talking to me. All right, so. Perfect. All right, so you kind of got a little bit of information about me. China did an excellent job sharing some of my background with you all. So you all know that I have elementary and special ed experience. I'm actually currently teaching in a cyber school, working with students with autism, completely virtual. And I am currently just about finished my principal certification, working on that right now, but done very soon. So I love quotes, and anybody that knows me knows I use quotes everywhere. And so I thought we'd start the presentation with some of those. So this first one says, it's not what you do for your children, but what you have taught them to do for themselves that will make them successful human beings. And so I have to say that, you know, everything that I've ever done in a classroom that I've been working in, I've always thought about how can I get these students to do this for themselves eventually, because I'm not always going to be there. The paraprofessionals aren't always going to be there. Their parents may not always be there. So as an educator, I feel like it's my job to make them as successful as possible on their own. And then I have another quote here that says, when you cut it for me, write it for me, find it for me, open it for me, tie it for me, all I learn is that you do it better than me. Oh, are my notes showing instead? Hang on, guys. Sorry about that. Yep, that's the wrong screen. Is that better? Aha, perfect. Sorry about that. All right. And with this quote, it's just, you know, a lot of times we want to step in and do things for our students, but are we actually helping them when we do it for them? Of course, we want to model for them and give them great examples of how to do things, but if we're doing everything for them, are we truly teaching them? So today we're going to dive into independence. And I always love to start with a definition of the word. So the word independent means to not be dependent and not depending on things, and not needing to rely on others for aid or support. And so that is always our overall goal when we're working with any student. Doesn't even have to be in the special education field. Obviously, we want them to be independent in what they are doing. So what can you do to promote that independence in the classroom? What are some things that you can, you know, get set up and create that will work well? Well, I've got 5 things that if you want to get started finding more ways to be creating that independence for your students, these are 5 different things that you can start to do. The first one is classroom setup and organization. The next one is your expectations, routines, and structure of your classroom. The next one is schedules and visuals. Then we have workstations or centers. And my last one that I want to talk with you about today is naturalistic teaching. So we're going to dive into each of these more specifically so that you guys can get some ideas on how to specifically do each of them. So the first one we're going to start with is classroom setup and organization. I'm sure many of us are kind of all in this realm right now. It's back to school season. You're thinking, how can I set up my classroom to make things run smoothly, not only just in the classroom, but for the students, for the staff, for yourself. So the first thing you want to do if you're setting up your classroom and getting it organized for students to be independent is you want to have an idea of what you envision that classroom looking like. What do you want students to be able to do on their own? And where do you need to place things in the classroom in order to make that happen? So I always suggest to have a map in your head and then even draw it out. So you can see here in the picture on the slide, this is just an example of drawing out how your classroom may look. I always like to start when I do my own, I always like to make an inventory and start with my biggest items first. So if I have a big area rug that we're going to use for morning meetings or for read alouds, I'm going to take that into account first. My big teacher desk, if I have one of those, or any other areas that take up a lot of space, because then you can always put those smaller things in wherever you find that extra room after you place those big items. The other thing you need to think about, obviously, is the placement of those areas in your classroom. So making sure that your quiet library maybe isn't next to a bathroom if you have one in your classroom, because it can get noisy and distracting for those students if they're hearing all those noises, or putting it next to your classroom door where it might be right next to the hallway and people are walking by. So your classroom setup and organization is something that you really want to consider when you are starting to build that independence for your students. And it's something you can do before your students even arrive. And lastly, thinking about the adaptive needs of your students. So if you know what students you're going to be having in your classroom that year, you've read through their IEPs, looking at what they need. I even think about students that if you have a student in a wheelchair or a walker, and you know, based on your classroom setup, you're going to need areas for them to be able to move around and physically be able to kind of go around the classroom and do it more independently without adult support, then you want to think of that as you're setting up your classroom. I love it. I'm checking in the comments here, guys. Need to Marie Kondo your classroom. Yes, please do. I always try every year to kind of do a little clear out of things. But and it can be hard. I see some of you talking about inheriting a classroom. That's also really hard because, you know, you're taking all those things from those teachers that you're taking the place of, and sometimes they had things set up maybe not the way you wanted it to. So when you're thinking about your classroom setup, I've just got a few questions here that maybe you want to think about while you're doing that. So what do you want the kids to do on their own? So do you want them to be able to sharpen a pencil on their own? If you do, then make sure they can reach it. If you want them to be able to get a tissue on their own, make sure they can reach the tissue box. Don't put it too high. So just thinking about those little things that maybe you don't want to be spending your entire day doing, and you know your students can do it for themselves, then you want to make sure those materials are accessible to them. Where can you store things for your students? So things like the pencils and the crayons and the erasers, you want them to have access to that so they can do it, make sure it's within their reach. And maybe also think about what you don't want them to reach. So I'm sure many of us have those times in our classrooms where, you know, you had a student that you didn't want to get the box of tissues because all the tissues just always constantly were leaving it. And I've definitely had a few of those in my case as well. So using things like curtains and other things to cover up those things you don't want students to get into is also a great way, and something you should think about with your setup. All right, so I found a couple tools. If you're not a drawer, if you like to go a little techie and want to really kind of think it out, I found 2 online tools that can help you with creating your classroom setup. The first one here is called the Floor Planner, and you can find that at kaplanco.com. And then the other one is called Smart Draw. Now, Smart Draw isn't necessarily meant for classrooms, but it actually has some really cool features inside of it. It's meant for like floor planning your house, so or other places like an office space or something. So if you're trying to redesign your house, you could also use this. But you can go into their templates, and I'm going to show you this video. You can go into their templates here, and then I decided to just find an office floor plan. You can see they have tons of different floor plans to choose from. And I picked one that looked the closest to my classroom. And when I opened it, then you could see inside, and it let you kind of edit where things were going to go. So I love this as well. If you don't want to draw or you don't like drawing, You can kind of move the pieces you can see here, like moving the chair and the desk around, turning the carpet. And it's a really cool tool if you want to find a different way or have a different way to work on your classroom setup. How do you approach inheriting and getting rid of things with para input thoughts, them not wanting to get rid of things? I think that comes with just having that conversation with that paraprofessional that it's your classroom and that you appreciate their thoughts and advice. But ultimately, it is your classroom, and you as the teacher get to make those decisions on what you feel it should be in your classroom for your students. So I know that can be a tough conversation to have, though. I've totally been there. All right, so when you're doing your classroom setup and organization, just a few more questions you can think about is, how are your students expected to enter the classroom? How are they expected to leave? How do you want them to transition inside the classroom? Where do you want your supplies located? Where will the work areas be? And where might you put a calm down area or a library? And where are your paraprofessionals going to work? And I'm probably giving you tons of questions here that maybe you're like, I don't know the answers. And that's okay, because the list can go on and on when it comes to thinking about what you're doing here. And I just think that thinking about these things before you get in there on day one is really important, just because you want to have things set up for success as much as you can. Granted, we can't prepare for everything that's going to be happening, but if we think about these things beforehand, we may have a better base of what we're doing. So yes, classroom tours. I love doing classroom tours. I'm also a huge real estate nut. Like, I love looking at houses, but classrooms as well. This picture here on this slide is my last brick and mortar classroom that I taught in. And you can see I have different tables and stations and areas that were kind of sectioned off from where students worked. You can even see in the back there, I have some curtains covering up materials to keep it less distracting, but also making it so materials were accessible by my students. All right, so a little bit more on organization here. So everything should have a place. You can use labels, both with words and pictures, depending on who you want to get access to those materials. For my students, I like the pictures and the words. And actually, China and Shayna did a really good job of showing you guys how you can make your own labels. So that kind of ties great into this. But making it so students can get to different things, even color coding things for your students is a really great strategy. You can see in the picture at the top here, these are some binders that I house student work in, but it's color coded. So the students know I'm color red, I'm color blue, and they knew how to get their materials because I had it organized in that fashion. And then these below here, these are just some schedules that are also color coded, which is another great way to keep your materials in a way that everybody understands where they are, who they belong to, and what's expected. And making sure your materials are within reach for the adults in the room too. So making sure your parents can get things if you're not able to. All right, and so with each of these tips that I'm going to give you today, I'm going to throw out a couple different items that I've personally used and loved when it comes to that topic. So for classroom setup and organization, some things that I've loved using are some of these like colored bins that you can put different labels on. Book bins for color coding and putting certain students' supplies in. These iris boxes I've loved to use both for color coding materials for students and then also just keeping them in a nice closed container so that when they're being used, only one is taken out at a time, etc. Table spots are another one that I love to use on the floor for lining up at the door, using them for where they work at a certain table. And then these clear labels are nice because you can change them in and out. So you don't have to always have the same label if you don't want to. All right, so our next one here is expectations, structure, and routine. Oh my, I had to just throw that in there and make it kind of fun. But thinking about the expectations you have for your students, the structure you want in your classroom, and the routines you want them to follow can make the world of difference in how your day runs in your classroom. And when you're doing those things for your students by setting those expectations, you're providing them with the opportunity to be more independent. They know what's expected of them. You've taught it, you've shown them what's expected, yet they are able to do it because you've practiced it over and over and over again. And we all know our students really thrive off of repetition and routine. And so when we keep things the same, they are really going to be successful. So starting on day one with your students, going over your rules, going over how you're going to do things, all those questions that I kind of asked you earlier to think about, When you have those answers, they're the things you're going to share with your students. This is how we line up at the door. This is how we pack up for the end of the day. Making sure you go over those expectations and rules a lot. I've heard teachers say they don't teach academics until October, November, because they're teaching these structures and routines. And that's okay. I'm all for teaching academics as well, but I do feel like expectations and routines are really important because we all still do those things in our everyday lives. We as adults do those things in our everyday lives. So we want to make sure that we're going over them even more than we think we should. I know sometimes my parents used to say to me, are we really going over the classroom rules again? And I'd be like, yeah, we are, because guess what? In April, you're going to be happy that we went over them because our students know them. So thanks, guys. And checking out your comments here saying, yes, absolutely. It is so important to get those routines down. So things like posting the rules up for everyone to see. I love using real photos because I've worked in both elementary and in secondary classrooms, and I think they're appropriate for both age groups. And they give a good representation for our students. And I've even incorporated things like these are some task cards that I've incorporated in my classroom that also go over those classroom rules. All right, so I've got another tool here that I love to use for part of my structure in my classroom and my routine. If you don't know about this website is called classroomscreen.com. If you don't know about it, write it down. There are so many things on here, and I'm going to show you like a little video that walks you through some of the things it does. My favorite though is the timer, because I set the structure in my classroom using the timer so my students know when it's time to transition next. So you can see here, there's a calendar you can use. There is a clock you can use, a stopwatch, which can be great for using it in the classroom as a countdown. This is the timer that I love to use. It's going to get noisy in one sec, just giving you a heads up, but you can see the visual there that counts it down. There's a stoplight, so you can use that if you want to set it up with your timer. When you get down to 2 minutes, maybe you're going to go from green to yellow, then go from yellow to red. There's work symbols to give students that expectation of what should they be doing right now, working together, working alone. Then there's other fun tools as well, such as drawing on the screen, using a text box. Lots of different options with this website. There's ways to put images and media in. You're going to see me throw a picture in here real quick. There you go. That you can use in the classroom as well. And then another fun aspect this has is it will also show you the sound level in the classroom. So if the students are getting too loud, they get to see a visual of, hey, it's getting too noisy. Here's some dice that you can just use for fun. And there's actually a ton more on here. So if you've never seen this before, I suggest you check it out. But for me, just that timer piece alone was what I used in my classroom every day. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about structure and what you can make your lessons look like so that students are more predicting what's going on and feeling more at ease when they're in your classroom. So try to structure your lessons so students can predict what is coming. Have a schedule for obviously your whole class, your staff, and your individual students. And make sure the staff knows this information as well. So even though you might think, I created this schedule, I need to know what's going on, your staff needs to too. They're there to support you and support your students. So make sure that you're providing that to them as well. So you see some pictures here. The first one all the way over to the one side, you can see like the gray and white boxes. That's actually a staff schedule that I created that we had posted in the classroom right up on the wall so that staff member could go back and check that whenever they wanted to. And like I said, I always ran my classroom in 15-minute structure increments. So that's where that timer came in that I just shared with you. And we used that to know where we were going next. Also, in terms of structure, I created something, this is just a quick visual I created of weekly activities. So my students knew when it was the day we were going to go to the library. When was it the day we were going to go to the gym? I had like a little arrow that pointed to the day of the week. So the students know, okay, if the arrow's on Thursday, guess what? It's our day to go pick up our backpacks from our backpack program. And so that helped to also set some structure and routine. And our students were much happier when they knew what was coming than being surprised and not knowing what was coming next. And then lastly, structuring work areas. So this area here is an independent work center that I had in my classroom. We called it binder work. It's literally what it sounds like, binders with work inside of it that students would complete. But when they got here, they got to see this sign that told them first they had to complete their work binder. So we kind of have a first then going on here. And then depending on what day of the week it was, then they would, pick another type of material that they were going to use. And then I've got my nice little reminder here that says work the whole time. So for any of my kids who would wander off a little bit, I could always point to that and be like, remember, we're supposed to work till the timer goes off. There's your reminder. So yes, that's been very helpful to have those visuals in your classroom. We're going to dive more into that though soon. And some quick ideas. If you have students that react well to audio transitions, so that timer had a little doorbell sound. I've seen teachers use those handheld wireless doorbells that you can stick on your lanyard. Use that for when they're transitioning, to give them that expectation and routine of knowing when that bell goes off, it's time. I know a lot of teachers, especially in the early elementary grades, will use some kind of a cleanup song or song that will kind of cue that they're moving on to something new. And then the good old 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, or any of those fun chants that you've heard teachers use to get students' attention. But granted, remember, all of this has to be taught. You can't just go in the classroom and assume every kid's going to know 1, 2, 3 and say eyes on me if you haven't practiced it. So, all right. Oh, I love that. Someone said they use Alexa in their classroom for songs and transitions. Yes, that's an excellent idea. So when we're talking about this, we want to have routines for everything. And again, I'm going to put a list here, but the list could go on and on. Think of all the routines you want your students to do in the classroom. Things like going to the bathroom, lining up at the door, any general classroom transitions. So times they're moving in the actual room, walking down the hallway, asking for help, packing up to go home, their work sessions with you or a paraprofessional. How your lessons are structured. So I think of more like whole group lessons. So if you do a read aloud or a morning meeting, how are you going to structure that to make it predictable for your students so that they can be successful? How to check your schedule, and then how to complete their independent work. And here's just a few visuals that I've used for students. You don't always have to have pictures. So I have an example here with words. And then I have one here with the pictures for how students, when they come in the morning, this was the expectation. And I actually put this right where they would hang their coats and backpacks. So as soon as they walked in the classroom and got to their hook, that's what they saw. So they knew that that was the expectation. And then if any of us needed to prompt that student, we could literally just point to the step they were on to kind of remind them what they needed to do next. All right, so here are some quick tools and things that you may want to check out if you want to start getting better at using expectation, structure, and routine in your classroom. So here's a picture of that doorbell that I was talking about that you can have in your classroom, and I'm pretty sure they make them so you can stick them right on a lanyard or a keychain so you can have it with you at all times. Using visual timers. We didn't talk about that too much, but using visual timers will absolutely help you and your students. And then just posting your classroom rules and expectations. And making sure that you go over them a lot. All right, so the next one I have for you, the schedules and visuals. So I feel like Oprah here, but pretty much when your students walk in the door, everybody needs to have a schedule. And I'm not just talking about the kids. Everyone needs a schedule. So I feel like Oprah with like you get a schedule and you get a schedule and you get a schedule, just giving all the schedules away. But it's so important that everybody knows what's expected, where you're supposed to be at all times. And it can be really stressful. I will have to say, I kind of love making schedules and I love the puzzle of figuring out how to get everything to work like a fine oiled machine where everybody is transitioning perfectly. I just love that part of this, but I know that's not everyone's cup of tea. So remember, when you're creating schedules, you're building your students' independence. And yes, I'm seeing you guys pop in the comments about, when you've got multiple grade levels that you're trying to schedule for, when you've got multiple students, some kids are going to different buildings, some kids are going to different specials, things like that. That can really be hard to make a schedule that works for everyone. So I can see where that love-hate relationship is. I will say that when I can get a schedule running perfectly, I'm like, oh, like it's amazing. So make sure though, when you're doing your schedules, that you're teaching your students how to check them. Teach them to walk over to the schedule. Teach them, how do they mark off that they've done something? Do they use a dry erase marker? Do they close a flap? How does that look? Teach them how to follow the schedule to see where they've left off and where they're going to next. And then how to handle changes to that schedule. So if we're teaching all of these skills when it comes to using schedules in the classroom, you're teaching independence. We all follow schedules. We in our jobs follow schedules. And, you know, it's kind of crazy to think about it, but everywhere you go, you're following a schedule. I'm sure you keep a calendar. I'm sure you keep track of appointments and things like that. So you're teaching your students life skills, functional skills for the rest of their lives. So when you're doing this, don't stress if you spend too much time or you feel like you're spending too much time on it, because this is what your students need. All right, so I've got some pictures here of some different kinds of schedules I've used in my classroom over the years. And first one here, this is actually the teacher. So this is me, and then two paraprofessionals that I had in my classroom one year. And this was our schedules. So I used to work in a middle school classroom. So on top of different grade levels, we had a bell schedule, just like a secondary school would have. So the bell would go off, which would be really confusing for my students, because a lot of times it had nothing to do with what they needed to do, except for maybe lunch and their special. The rest of the day they were with us. So like they would hear that auditory cue and get confused, but it was a bit of to train their brains to think that way. Was a bit tricky, but I also made it so everybody knew what was expected, who's going to work with who when. I color coded it so you can see all the colors on there. We color coded everything, because then they knew, okay, so and so is this color. And then from there, these are some student schedules. You can see a couple different versions here. These ones are all mostly closing the flap, but then some of them also have more text than they do visuals. But these were really great for building independence for a lot of my students, because they could close. The pieces wouldn't fall off, because we all know how that is when you lose a piece to something. And we kept them in a central location on this whiteboard. So every time a transition took place, all the students lined up at the schedule, checked their schedule, moved on to where they went next. And it just was something they did every transition and something we practiced. And then this image is the same schedule, except for I used real pictures. So if you're not into using the clip art versions of a schedule, be sure to also think about the fact too that is your student going to understand the picture for break is actually break, or would it be better to have a real picture of your classroom on that schedule where your break area is? Is that student going to relate to that better? And then of course the good old first then schedule, so helping our students with those schedules of understanding. First I do this, then I get this, is always a great way to set them up for success. All right, and then I've got some fun visuals for you guys. So make sure when you're setting up visuals for your students that they are actually helping your students. Make sure they are functional. Make sure they're building that independence. So labeling the classroom so students know where things belong. So just like we talked about earlier, creating labels for your classroom, making sure that, maybe the school tools you're using or manipulatives you're using have labels so students know where things go to put them away and to even get them out. Using color-coded labels so students know their places. So I always made my student name tags with their color. So their name tag, you can see kind of here in the middle, is an example of color-coding the students' name tags. So it was easier for them to find them. If they knew everything in the classroom for me was green, then they know to find that. And if we need to teach them to kind of fade that skill out later, we could. But I always liked doing the color-coded for their name tags and things like that so that it helped them to more easily find their materials. Make sure you're increasing the communication and vocabulary of the students. So kind of these images on either side are both ways that also help create communication opportunities for our students. So this is a little break time choice board where you can see Legos, drawing, sensory room, where students would choose an activity when it became break time on their schedule. But for my students that were complex communicators, I would have them take that piece off as if almost like text where it would be handed to you. But that also gave them that opportunity to communicate, because I often found I had students, if I just gave them a board with choices on it, they might tap every single choice. And then I don't really know what they wanted. So by making them actually physically take a piece off and hand it to me, I was more sure of what they were picking. And I was able to give them some different choices when maybe just saying the 3 or 4 things they could do didn't actually receptively go in for our students, because we know how much our students can sometimes have issues with processing things. So by providing that visual, we're giving them that independence to make choices for themselves. And then this one over here is just some Go Noodle songs. So we would do some brain breaks in the classroom. And I loved to use this Go Noodle for students that couldn't tell me verbally what they wanted to listen to. They could pick a picture off and hand it to me for the song that represented what they wanted to listen to. All right, and then lastly, for some different schedules and visuals, there's things like mini schedules. So breaking apart small parts of your day, but making a schedule for it so it's more easy for students to follow along and complete the steps of it. This picture right here is an example of some of the mini schedules I've used in my classroom before. And they're nice too because they're portable. So students could take them with them around the room if they needed to. Using things like anchor charts down here, you can see these are for WH questions, and all they are is giving more of an explanation of if you're asked a certain type of WH question, how might you answer it? So if I'm asked a who question, I'm probably going to want to answer with a person or an animal, and you can see some pictures to give examples to kind of help prompt that student or get that student thinking about how to more independently answer that question. And then things like, again, the first then schedule is always a great one to help you. And then working for boards are also great, the token boards that help students to know when they're going to be finished working with something and when they're going to earn what they're working for. And just having that independence of being able to see that is going to help them to be more willing to continue working. And yes, I would agree. There are so many moving parts to a special education classroom. And there are so many different things you can do when it comes to using a lot of these strategies for your students. All right, so a few more ideas of some materials that you may want to think about using to build and promote independence when you have schedules and visuals for your students. So I like these two here for like a whole class schedule. So if you wanted to have one up on your whiteboard or somewhere in an area of the room that's centralized for everyone to look at and just get a general gist of what the day is doing. I love using pocket charts. This one's really nice because you can take it off and put it into that all done bucket kind of at the bottom. And then these ones I chose because I love that they were different colors. So if you wanted to color code your students' schedules so that they knew which one was theirs and could go over to it, you could do something like these pocket charts to do that. And then I am a lover of all things visuals that are portable. So this is a great little keychain that's got lots of different visuals on it telling you wait, stop, more, yes, no, that you can use with the students, your staff can use with the students, but also help to prompt the students to be more independent in doing different things in the classroom. All right, so the fourth thing, oh, I'm glad they are helping you with that. That's awesome. The fourth one I have for you is workstations and centers. So I know some people are familiar with the idea of independent workstations, and some of you may be more familiar with the idea of just having centers in your classroom. Either way, the goal of those in your classroom is to build the stamina for your students to work on their own. So you're usually in this type of a setup trying to work maybe with another student just one-on-one, or you're working with a group of students in a small group. When I taught in elementary school, I did guided reading groups, and I had a small group of students I worked with, and the rest were in the room doing some kind of centers, whether they were phonics-based or math-based. In my special education classroom, I typically worked with my students one-on-one, and they would rotate to some of these different centers when they weren't working with me or a paraprofessional. And the goal was for them to work on their own so that I could work with those students that were at my table. But if we're not teaching and building our students' independence, they're not going to be able to do this, which ultimately means we're not going to be able to get that time with the other students that we want to work with. So the top two pictures here are just two different stations that I had in my classroom. The one was the binder work that I talked about earlier. Students would come over here, grab a binder off the shelf, and complete the work inside. I typically tried to pick work that was right at their level so that it was easy for them to complete. And then this station, I called it the life skills area. So inside this one cabinet, there was a place to hang clothes. They could sort shoes in a shoe organizer. You can see the little vacuum poking out there. Lots of different life skills activities that students could do, folding clothes, sorting silverware, folding napkins, lots of different things that they could practice to build more life skills independence, but also have something meaningful to do while I worked with their peers. And then this is just an example of, if you guys didn't think I showed you enough schedules, here's a schedule I used for their work tasks. And I'm going to share a video with you on the next slide of kind of seeing this in action, but you can see that I had students' names that are kind of covered up here, but then they're assigned different numbers and letters, and those correspond to the bins that they would take out and then complete independently. All right, so I am a lover of all things the Autism Helper, and she does a great job here with this quick video explaining what an independent workstation could look like for you. Oh, sorry. Oh, there's no sound. All right, so what I will do is I will just explain it to you. So what the students are going to do is they are going to take one of those letters off of there, and then they're going to find the bin. You can see all the bins over here, all the bins over here, and they're going to put it next to the bin that it corresponds with. And when they do that, then they take the bin and they take it to an area of the classroom that's been designated for them to complete that work in. It could be a table, it could be a desk, and they take it over, complete the materials inside, put it back, then they go to the next one. And you can see there's a couple different ways this is set up. Some students have Velcro letters. Some of them have ones that are written that they cross off with a dry erase marker. But all of this is setting up how you might set up a workstation in your classroom for students. And it doesn't have to take up a lot of space. You can see here she's got 2 shelves. I had 1 or 2 shelves in my classroom for my independent workspace. And I just tried to maximize the heck out of it and put tons of bins in one place for my students. But this was something we practiced at the beginning of the year, and it was something that we did over and over and over again until it became routine and habit, and then it created independent work that my students could complete so I could work with others. All right, so within your independent workstation, some things you're gonna want to note and do is you're gonna wanna start with lots of visuals so students know what to complete. You can kind of see that here. I got a question. Do you collect data on independent work then completion? For some students I did, and some students I didn't. It depended on if they had a goal for working on independence. So a lot of my students, if I created a goal for them that said they would work independently with so many, we might work on decreasing the number of prompts that they need. I would have a paraprofessional that would hang back, keep an eye on the student, and be taking data on a clipboard over it. But not every student in my classroom did I take data on. I know some teachers like to take data on the completion of work, and that, just as long as it corresponds with your goals correctly and you know that you're getting valid data out of it, absolutely, you could collect data on that too. So this visual right over here is an example of how you're going to show the students what they're going to do in it. And I've even had instructions inside of a bin that shows maybe some steps on how to complete it if the students aren't sure how to. But my biggest thing with the independent workstations is that it should be independent, meaning the students should be able to open the bin, take out the materials, and complete it. If you're giving them something that they can't do on their own, it kind of defeats the purpose of them working so that you can work with others. So just think about that. And sometimes it's hard to take a step back and give our students work that we may think is easy, but actually we're teaching them to work on their own. We're teaching them things that they're going to take with them when they get a job, when they go out into the community, when they're living in their homes. They need to be able to functionally complete things on their own. And yes, it needs to be on their level. So don't feel frustrated if you're worried if you're making things too easy for them. Sorry, just reading through the comments, guys. All right, so what do you do if they complete it quicker than you anticipate or get bored with the repetition? Well, I've often thrown in more tasks. So if I notice on a regular basis they're completing early, I've given them a few more. I've also extended the task by making them complete more of it. So this one in the middle here where they're flipping on a clothespin, different colors, I might add a few more to it and just increase the amount in the box to make that last longer. What can be an independent task for students developmentally lower? I love that question. I'm going to get to that right here. So things that can be done with any age group. Starting with the youngest is the best, and you want to use what's called put-in tasks or tasks that are considered errorless. So ones that you would provide minimal support or no prompting if possible. So literally the students in a lot of these, this one right here with the fruit manipulatives, they're literally just picking up and putting inside, picking up and putting inside. That's what a put in task is. The other two here with these coins, or yeah, the coins are just putting inside. So putting inside the baby wipe container, putting inside the coffee container. This one's another put in, but it adds an academic flair to it, which I liked for any of our students that maybe we want to work on something like letter identification, number identification, shapes they pick up, and they have to place it inside an ice cube tray, moving them to the correct letter. So thank you for that question. All right, and then some materials that I love to use to promote independence. So first off, a time tracker. So I like that for workstations, because if my students need to see that countdown of when they're going to be done working to kind of keep them going and know when their end is coming, I always used to joke with my paraprofessionals that, you know, if say you were at the gym and you were on a treadmill and your trainer was like, okay, you got 5 minutes to go. And then all of a sudden you're on the treadmill, you get done those 5 minutes and your trainer goes, oh, hold on, we're going to do 5 more minutes. And you're like, what? Like, how frustrating is that? So to do that to our students is not fair either. And that kind of goes into the question we had earlier, when students get finished early. If you structure out their time to make sure, I also have even kind of timed students at the beginning of the year, see how long it takes them to complete a task, to try to avoid that. My higher functioning students that might get done early, I might actually reward them with getting a little bit of extra break time, because if they work efficiently and independently, I don't want to punish them by giving them more work, like that whole treadmill situation. So maybe I give them a break, as long as they can handle it, of course. This rolly cart is great because I had students that couldn't physically handle the transition of moving around the room. So moving to my work task area, my classroom, was difficult for them, but moving the work tasks to them worked really well. So I love having some materials on wheels that I can use for students if I need to. And then I would just put lots of numbers and letters on the front of these to label them, and then have a schedule for the students, and they knew who to complete and when to complete. And if we needed to move it to multiple students' desks, we could do that too. Yes, Rebecca, I do. I have lots of ideas on Errorless Tasks. You can check it both on my blog and my website. And I actually just did a presentation for that this summer, all about errorless learning. So if anybody wants to know more about that, just reach out to me. And then these are 2 pre-made tasks. And while we can make a lot of things for our classroom, sometimes it's just easier to buy something, and not that I'm promoting buying by all means. But these were 2 that I just really liked. This one, because we were working on sorting colors, which I know is a skill a lot of us might use in a primary classroom. And then this one was kind of cool because I like the lock and key, which kind of gives you that functional practice. I've even seen teachers take real locks and keys from like the dollar store that you can get and do those as a task as well, which adds in some of that functional piece to it. All right, so last one I have for you, last tip, is use naturalistic teaching. So if you're not familiar with naturalistic teaching, you're essentially just naturally going through what you would do in your classroom, and you're making sure you're finding moments, teachable moments that you can use with your students. And a lot of times when you're doing that, you're probably building your students' independence by doing that, right? Because maybe they didn't know how to tie their shoe, but they stopped in the hallway and they needed help. So you take that extra minute or 2 to teach them that. So you're building their independence with it. So these are just a few different ways that I've done that. So be prepared to look for moments to teach independence. Doesn't mean every second of the day we're drilling our kids to do things. But trying to find those moments. I often use my cooking classes a lot for naturalistic teaching, because I'd realize a kid couldn't use a can opener, or I'd realize they didn't know how a toaster worked. And then I would take that opportunity to teach them how it worked. So life skills usually work really great with this, but you can do it with all different kinds of things. And sometimes setting up those situations where students need to ask for help is a great way to teach them to build independence too. So you're getting ready to do a worksheet. Everybody's sitting at the table and they've got their worksheet in front of them, and they all need a pencil, but you don't give them one. See who responds and raises their hand, or goes on their communication device and says pencil, or looks for one, maybe gets up out of their seat to look for a pencil. Like, as much as we may want our students to stay in our seat, we also kind of want to give them props for actually looking for a pencil. So those are all ways we can promote independence for our students, by setting up some situations for them where maybe they need something and we're trying to teach them how to independently get something for themselves. And then the other idea I love too is just using different adaptive tools that will make work easier for our students. So right here, you can even see on this sorting tray, I drew visuals of knife, fork, spoon. It's by no means beautiful artwork there, but it helped my students to know where to put the different pieces of silverware. This is one of those contraptions that teaches you how to fold shirts. And that was really good for helping my students to understand how to fold the shirts easier than just rolling it into a ball and throwing it in the container. Now, granted, we did teach that skill to the students. I would have a para that maybe worked with a student on it for a few weeks, maybe longer, to get them that information or get that practice in. But then once they got good at it, they did it for their independent work. And actually, if I'm being honest, my own children at my house use one of these to fold our laundry. So no shame for using that. So any of you parents out there, we were talking earlier about who's a parent here. Any of those parents who want their kids to fold more laundry for you, you might want to grab one of these. All right, and then setting up your situations where students need to ask for help. So you can see here, I'm holding these popsicle sticks and they are telling the student to check their schedule. Now, obviously you're going to want to use this with a student who can read. But doing that instead of verbally telling the students, if you're familiar with prompting and the hierarchy of prompting, we always are with the goal in mind of fading those prompts. So when you can give a visual or something instead that they can use instead of us telling them to do something, we're building their independence. And with this, I would hand the student the check schedule stick, and there was a bucket right next to that student's schedule. So they would have to take it over to the bucket, drop the popsicle stick in, and then they're right at their schedule where they need to be, and they can just check their schedule from there. Oh, I love it. Somebody said, I intentionally make messes. So one of my students had to get it. Yes, cleaning up the messes and helping when they needed a task so they could learn to clean up. Love it. Perfect. Yes. Love it. Yes. This slideshow as a resource. Yes, I believe so, that you guys can have access to this PowerPoint presentation. I'll make sure that you guys have that, okay? And then what else did I have? Limit your prompts as much as possible. We talked about that too. Here's another example of putting some visuals in place for naturalistic teaching and things like where to hang your coat, where to hang your backpack. Putting little visuals in places so students know where those things belong helps them to be more independent. And here's some of the ideas that I talked about just a few minutes ago of some different things you can use for naturalistic teaching. Things like these adapted scissors where students squeeze them instead of using the real scissors if they're struggling with those fine motor skills. Utensils that either have a bigger grip or these ones that you kind of slide onto the hand to help them with eating. Here's that clothes, shirt and pants folder that I suggested earlier for folding laundry. Materials for tying shoes is always a great one. And then this one is for coloring. So if you have students that struggle with the fine motor skills of holding a smaller crayon, holding something like this with that bigger ball on it will be easier for them to be able to hold on to and color. And yes, OT, your occupational therapists, are great for these things specifically. So I highly suggest if you're not working with your occupational therapist, you should totally talk with them about what things can you provide for your students in the classroom, or what skills could they be doing or working on that could help promote their independence, because they could be really a good wealth of knowledge. The name of that coloring tool, I am actually not sure. I think I just put in, I can't even remember the search term I used when I looked for it, just like a big crayon, adaptive crayons I might have put in. If anybody else knows the name of it, feel free to drop that in the comments. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I just did adaptive crayon, and I believe that came up when I searched it. All right, well, I wanted to say thank you for all of you guys for showing up today, and be sure to go check out those linked resources that are on the website, because I have some special things for you guys. I have exclusive freebies in there. I also have a coupon for you guys to use in my shop. If you're interested, I have lots of resources in a free resource library, and my blog also has lots of information if you guys want to learn anything more about building independence in the classroom. And thank you guys so much for your time.
Okay, awesome job, Jen. Thank you so much. We have about 5 minutes, so if you guys have any additional questions or anything you want to share, go ahead and put them in there. She had so many amazing resources. Yeah, Jen, if you want to email over the PowerPoint, we can upload that for people too if they'd like. But she also has an amazing resource that she sent to us already that you guys will be able to find a ton of links and things that you need. So we really, really appreciate that. Just so you guys all know, we will once again have a post go up on our exclusive Facebook group right after this. So make sure that you guys are sharing what your key takeaways were from this.